The stars looked different out here in the Kepler expanse, Captain Kyle Bennett thought, as he stood on the bridge of the Horizon Seeker. They were dimmer, scattered like dust across the black canvas of space. His ship had been traveling for 3 months, cataloging star systems that nobody had bothered to explore before. It was supposed to be routine work, the kind of mission that filled reports but rarely made history. Kyle ran his hand through his dark hair and checked the time. Another 6 hours until his shift ended. Then he could grab some sleep and start the whole process again tomorrow. Commander Lisa Vaughn sat at the sensor station, her eyes fixed on the screens in front of her. She had been monitoring space for anomalies all day and found nothing but empty void. Then something changed. A small blip appeared on her screen, then another. She leaned forward, adjusting the controls to get a clearer reading. The pattern was odd, repeating every few minutes like a heartbeat in the darkness. "Captain, I have something strange here," Lisa called out without looking away from her screen. Kyle walked over to her station, his boots making soft sounds on the metal floor. He looked at the data scrolling across the display. It was definitely a signal, artificial in origin. Someone or something was broadcasting into the void, and the Horizon Seeker had stumbled upon it by pure chance. Peter Grant, the communications officer, was already working on isolating the signal when Kyle reached his station. Peter was young, barely 25, but he knew his equipment better than anyone else on the ship. His fingers moved quickly across the controls as he filtered out the background noise of space. After a few minutes, he played the cleaned-up signal through the bridge speakers. It was haunting, a series of tones that seemed to carry desperation even without words anyone could understand. "That is an old emergency frequency," Peter said quietly. "Real old, like ancient civilization old. Nobody has used this channel in thousands of years according to our databases." Kyle felt his pulse quicken. This was not routine anymore. This was something that could change everything. "Where is it coming from?" Lisa asked, already working to pinpoint the source. Her screen showed a planet in the system, one that their initial scans had marked as uninhabitable and not worth detailed study. The signal was definitely coming from there. Kyle pulled up the planetary data and frowned at what he saw. The planet was classified as a Class 7 death world by human standards. The gravity was crushing. The atmosphere would burn through most materials in hours, and temperature swings could freeze water solid or boil it away within the same day. Kyle called for a meeting with his senior staff in the conference room 15 minutes later. Dr. Amanda Price, the chief science officer, arrived first. She was in her 40s with gray streaks in her brown hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Chief engineer Greg Morris came next, wiping grease from his hands with a cloth. Medical officer Dr. Nicole Carter walked in carrying a tablet, already reviewing the preliminary data about the planet. "We have a decision to make," Kyle began, once everyone was seated. "There is a distress signal coming from that planet down there. Protocol says we report it and wait for instructions from command. That could take weeks. But that signal sounds desperate." Amanda pulled up a detailed analysis of the planet on the main screen. "This world is dying," she said matter-of-factly. "The core is unstable. I am seeing seismic activity that suggests major geological events in the near future. If someone is down there calling for help, they probably do not have weeks." "Can we even land on that planet?" Lisa asked. Greg Morris nodded slowly. "Our shuttles are tough, built for rough conditions. We can make it down and back. It will not be comfortable, but it is possible. The real question is what we find when we get there." Kyle looked around the table at his officers. He knew what the right decision was, even if it meant breaking protocol. "We go down," he said simply. "If someone is in trouble down there, we help them. That is what humans do." 2 hours later, 2 shuttles dropped away from the Horizon Seeker and began their descent toward the planet. Kyle was in the first shuttle along with Lisa, Security Chief Jacob Hayes, Dr. Christine Walsh, who specialized in alien biology, and 6 Marines led by Lieutenant Frank Dixon. The second shuttle carried additional equipment and more Marines. Ryan Scott, one of their best pilots, handled the controls of the lead shuttle with steady hands even as the craft began to shake from atmospheric turbulence. The descent was violent. Wind speeds in the upper atmosphere reached levels that would tear apart most civilian craft. Ryan fought the controls, his jaw clenched in concentration as he guided them through layer after layer of hostile air. Kelly Hughes, piloting the second shuttle, stayed close behind them. The exterior temperature readings climbed rapidly, then dropped just as fast. This planet did not want visitors. They broke through the clouds and got their first look at the surface. It was a nightmare landscape of sharp rocks and smoking fissures. Mountains that glowed with strange blue light rose in the distance. The ground itself seemed to pulse with an inner heat. Ryan brought the shuttle down in a relatively flat area near the source of the signal, though calling it flat was generous. The landing gear creaked under the stress of the higher gravity. "Everyone gear up," Jacob Hayes called out as the shuttle doors opened. The security chief was a big man, built solid and trained for hostile environments. His team moved efficiently, checking weapons and equipment. Kyle pulled on his environmental suit, feeling the servos engaged to help him move in the heavier gravity. Even with the suit doing most of the work, he could feel the weight pressing down on him. The structure they found was massive, partially buried in the hostile terrain. It was clearly artificial, built from materials that had somehow survived exposure to this brutal environment for what must have been centuries. Parts of it glowed with the same blue light they had seen on the mountains. The entrance was partially sealed, but Greg Morris, who had insisted on coming down with the second wave, quickly rigged a way to open it. Inside, the air was breathable, kept that way by systems that still functioned after all this time. Kyle ordered everyone to keep their helmets on anyway until they knew more. They moved through corridors that were too tall for human proportions, clearly built by beings larger than themselves. Emergency lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. Then they found the survivors. In a large chamber that might have once been a gathering hall, dozens of beings huddled together. They were tall, maybe 7 feet, with skin that looked almost crystalline. 4 limbs, 2 legs, and 2 arms. Their eyes were large and multifaceted, reflecting the emergency lights in rainbow patterns. When they saw the humans, they did not run or attack. They simply stared, as if unable to believe what they were seeing. One of them stepped forward, moving with a grace that seemed impossible in the heavy gravity. This one wore what looked like ceremonial robes and carried themselves with obvious authority. Peter Grant activated his translation equipment, hoping it could make sense of whatever language these beings spoke. The being spoke, and after a moment, the translator kicked in. The voice that came through was female, elderly and filled with wonder. "You came," she said. "After all this time, someone actually came. We are the Viridians. I am Elder Kithara. We have been calling into the void for so long we stopped believing anyone would answer." Kyle removed his helmet, a gesture of trust. "I am Captain Kyle Bennett of the human ship Horizon Seeker. We received your distress signal." "What happened here?" Elder Kithara's crystalline features seemed to dim with sadness. "Our world is dying. The core has become unstable. We have perhaps days before this entire continent tears itself apart. We activated the old beacon, the one our ancestors installed when they first came here. We hoped someone in the galaxy still remembered us, but our civilization fell long ago. We thought we were alone." "How many of you are here?" Lisa asked gently. Elder Kithara looked back at her people. "Over 3,000 souls. Children, elders, everyone who was left of our colony. We have nowhere else to go." Kyle felt the weight of that number. His ship could maybe take 200 people in emergency conditions. This was impossible, but he looked at the Viridians, saw the hope beginning to kindle in their strange eyes, and knew he could not walk away. He pulled Lisa aside. "Get a message to Admiral Stone at Forward Station Orion. Tell her we need every ship that can fly. We are not leaving these people behind." Lisa nodded and moved to contact the shuttle. Kyle turned back to Elder Kithara. "Help is coming," he said with more confidence than he felt. "We just need to keep everyone alive until it gets here." The Elder's crystalline form seemed to brighten. "You would do this for us? For strangers?" Kyle smiled. "That is what humans do." The message from the Horizon Seeker reached Forward Station Orion 8 hours after Kyle sent it. Admiral Victoria Stone was reviewing supply reports when her communications officer rushed into her office with a priority transmission. She listened to Kyle's message twice, her expression growing more serious with each word. 3,000 sentient beings trapped on a dying world, a human ship that could only save a fraction of them. A captain asking for the impossible. Victoria had been in command for 12 years. She had seen plenty of difficult situations, made plenty of hard calls, but this was different. Protocol said she should forward the message up the chain of command, let the admirals and politicians debate what to do. That could take weeks. These people had days. She looked at the star charts, calculating distances and response times. Then she made her decision. Activate emergency response protocol, she told her staff. Every human ship within 3 sectors is to proceed immediately to these coordinates. I do not care if they are cargo haulers or military vessels. I do not care if they are carrying supplies or passengers. Everyone goes now. Her staff stared at her for a moment. The emergency response protocol had never been used before. Not since it was established after Earth's close call with an asteroid impact 50 years ago. It gave military commanders the authority to commandeer civilian vessels in extreme situations. Using it was a career-ending move if things went wrong. But Victoria did not hesitate. Send the orders, she repeated. Within an hour, messages flashed across human space. Captain Helen Rogers was hauling colonists to a new settlement when her ship's computer chimed with new orders. She read them, then immediately woke her sleeping passengers to explain the change of plans. Her ship, the Endeavour, was designed to carry thousands in cryosleep. She could help. Commander Paul Martinez received his orders while his heavy cruiser Defender was on patrol near the border. He did not question them. He simply calculated the fastest route and ordered maximum speed. Captain Sophie Clark was 3 days into a luxury cruise when the order came through. Her ship, the Constellation, was filled with wealthy passengers expecting fine dining and entertainment. She gathered everyone in the main ballroom and explained the situation. Some complained. Most did not. One elderly woman stood up and said her grandson was serving on a survey ship somewhere out there. If someone needed help, they should go help them. The rest of the passengers agreed. Mining ships, survey vessels, cargo haulers, even small private craft changed course and headed for the Kepler expanse. 32 ships in total, representing every type of vessel humanity had put into space. None of them were designed for rescue operations. None of them were properly equipped. But they were going anyway because that was what the emergency response protocol demanded. And more importantly, because it was the right thing to do. Back on the dying planet, Kyle and his crew worked frantically to prepare for the evacuation. Greg Morris studied the Viridian shelter's power systems, with the help of a Viridian engineer named Velkoth. The two of them did not speak the same language fluently yet, but engineers had their own universal language of gestures and diagrams. Together, they rigged a solution that would keep the shelter's shields running for a few extra days. Dr. Nicole Carter worked with the Viridian healers to understand their biology. She needed to know what kind of atmosphere they could breathe, what temperature ranges they could survive, what kind of food they could eat. The good news was that Viridians were surprisingly compatible with human life support. They breathed similar air, tolerated similar temperatures, and could even digest some human food with minor adjustments. The bad news was that their crystalline structure made them heavy. Each Viridian weighed nearly twice what a human did. That meant fewer people per shuttle, fewer per ship. Dr. Christine Walsh spent her time learning everything she could about Viridian culture. Elder Kethara proved to be a wealth of information. The Viridians, she learned, had once been part of the galactic community thousands of years ago. They had helped found what eventually became the Galactic Assembly. But philosophical differences led them to withdraw, to seek isolation on remote worlds like this one. They had hoped to preserve their culture in peace. Instead, they had nearly gone extinct in obscurity. Lieutenant Frank Dixon and Security Chief Jacob Hayes organized the evacuation lists. They worked with a Viridian coordinator named Thelmus to identify who should go first when the ships arrived. Children and their parents, the elderly and infirm, scholars who carried irreplaceable knowledge, artists who preserved cultural memory. It was grim work, essentially triaging an entire civilization. But it had to be done. The planet did not wait patiently for them to prepare. Every few hours, tremors shook the ground. Fissures opened in the surrounding terrain, spewing toxic gases and molten rock. The mountains in the distance were slowly crumbling. Amanda Price, monitoring the situation from the Horizon Seeker in orbit, sent increasingly worried reports. The planet's core was destabilizing faster than her models predicted. They might have 4 days instead of a week. News of the rescue operation spread across human space faster than the ships themselves. On Earth, people gathered in public spaces to watch the news feeds. The footage from the planet showed the desperate situation clearly. Children huddled with their parents in the failing shelter. Engineers working frantically to keep systems running. Marines standing guard against the possibility of structural collapse. It was impossible to watch and not feel compelled to help. Nathan Foster, a history teacher on Luna, found himself interviewed by a dozen news outlets. Why were humans doing this, the reporters asked. Why risk so much for strangers? Nathan thought about it for a moment. Because we remember what it is like to be in danger, he said. Earth almost died a dozen times in our history. We remember what it feels like to need help and wonder if anyone will come. So when we hear someone calling for help, we go. That is who we are. The Galactic Assembly noticed what humanity was doing, and their reaction was mixed. At Assembly headquarters on the planet Concord, ambassadors from dozens of species gathered in emergency session. Ambassador Daniel Wright, humanity's representative, was summoned to explain his species' actions. He stood before the council with as much dignity as he could manage. The council was led by Archon Thelvas, a member of the Savorian Accord who had served on the council for longer than humanity had been traveling in space. Thelvas spoke in the slow, measured tones of someone who had seen countless crises come and go. Ambassador Wright, your species has mobilized a fleet without assembly authorization. You are violating numerous protocols. We have assessment teams en route that will arrive in 2 weeks to evaluate the situation properly. Daniel kept his voice respectful but firm. With respect, Archon, in 2 weeks those people will be dead. The planet they are on is tearing itself apart. We do not have time for proper procedures. We have to act now. Another council member, a insectoid being from the Kelthian hive, clicked its mandibles in disapproval. This is precisely the problem with your species. You act without thinking. You rush in where wiser beings would proceed with caution. What if your rescue attempt fails? What if you make the situation worse? Then we will have tried, Daniel replied. We will have done everything we could. But we will not stand by and watch people die while we fill out forms and wait for committee approvals. That is not who we are. The exchange was broadcast across assembly space. Billions of beings from hundreds of species watched as this young race openly challenged the established order. Reactions varied wildly. Some species admired human courage. Others feared human recklessness. The Calorians, a warrior culture, found themselves unexpectedly impressed. The Thales engineers were fascinated by the improvised nature of the rescue fleet. The ancient Twilight Collective, mysterious even by assembly standards, watched with interest. Back on the dying planet, Kyle received word that the first ships would arrive in 36 hours. It was cutting it close, but it might be enough. He gathered the senior staff and the Viridian leaders to coordinate the final plans. We start loading the moment the first ship arrives, he explained. Shuttles will run continuous routes from surface to orbit. We will work around the clock until everyone is off this rock. Elder Kythera listened carefully, then asked the question that had been bothering her since the humans arrived. Why are you doing this? You do not know us. We cannot repay you. Your own authorities seem opposed to this action. Yet you came anyway, why? Kyle thought about all the fancy answers he could give. He thought about human history, about the values they claimed to hold, about the speeches politicians made. But in the end, he settled on the simplest truth. Because you called for help and we heard you, that is enough. The elder's crystalline features brightened, a Viridian expression of emotion that the humans were learning to recognize. In all my years across all the civilizations I have studied, I have never encountered a species quite like yours. Other races would have calculated the cost, weighed the benefits, considered the political implications. You simply heard someone in trouble and came running. It is remarkable. It is terrifying. It is beautiful. A massive tremor shook the shelter, reminding everyone that time was running out. Lights flickered. Dust fell from. The first ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system, exactly 34 hours after Admiral Stone sent the emergency orders. Helen Rogers brought the Endeavour in first, its massive hull designed to carry thousands of colonists in suspended animation. Behind her came the Defender with Commander Paul Martinez at the helm, its military-grade engines already compensating for the gravitational anomalies that Amanda Price had warned about. Then came the Constellation, Sophie Clark's luxury liner that had been hastily converted into a rescue vessel. More ships arrived over the next few hours. Mining vessels with their heavy-duty cargo bays, survey ships built for long-duration missions, even a few private yachts whose owners had volunteered their craft for the rescue. By the time the last ship arrived, Admiral Victoria Stone had assembled a fleet of 32 vessels. It was not much by military standards, But for a rescue operation thrown together in less than 2 days, it was nothing short of miraculous. Victoria coordinated everything from her command carrier Resolution. She had divided the fleet into 3 groups. The large transports like the Endeavour would take the bulk of the refugees. The smaller, more maneuverable ships would run supplies and handle special cases. The Defender would anchor the whole operation, using its powerful engines to stabilize orbits for the civilian vessels. It was a plan built on hope and determination rather than proper military doctrine, but it was the best they could do. Down on the surface, Kyle watched the ships arrive on his scanner and felt a surge of relief. They had actually come. Dozens of ships had dropped everything and raced across space to help. He activated his communication system. "All ships, this is Captain Bennett on the ground. Welcome to Hell. We are beginning evacuation operations immediately." The shuttles began their runs within the hour. Ryan Scott and Kelly Hughes flew the first trips, their craft loaded with Viridian children and their parents. The descent through the atmosphere was just as violent as before, maybe worse as the planet's instability increased. Ryan gritted his teeth and fought the controls, feeling the shuttle buck and shake around him. Behind him, Lisa Vaughn helped keep the Viridian passengers calm, though she suspected they were probably less scared than she was. The evacuation became a continuous operation. Shuttles flew down, loaded as many Viridians as they could safely carry, flew back up to the waiting ships, unloaded, and immediately started the cycle again. The pilots worked in shifts, but even with breaks, it was exhausting work. Every trip meant navigating the hostile atmosphere, landing on increasingly unstable ground, and racing against time to get back to orbit before the next seismic event. On the Endeavour, Helen Rogers watched her ship fill with refugees. Her crew had converted the cryo-sleep chambers into basic living spaces. It was crowded and uncomfortable, but it would work for the journey back to human space. She walked through the corridors, seeing Viridian families huddled together, their crystalline forms catching the light in strange and beautiful ways. Children clung to their parents. Elders sat quietly, their multifaceted eyes watching everything with a mixture of fear and hope. Dr. Nicole Carter set up a medical bay on the Constellation, working alongside a Viridian healer named Shalnara. The two of them treated injuries from the ongoing earthquakes and stress-related illnesses. Nicole found that Viridian medicine was surprisingly advanced in some ways. They used crystalline resonance to diagnose internal injuries, something human scanners could not do as effectively. Shalnara was equally impressed by human surgical techniques and pharmaceutical knowledge. Different species, different approaches, but the same goal of healing and helping. 30 hours into the evacuation, disaster struck. A seismic event far larger than anything they had experienced before tore through the valley where the shelter stood. The ground split open. Ancient Viridian structures that had stood for centuries began to collapse. Kyle, who was coordinating shuttle operations from inside the shelter, felt the floor drop beneath his feet. Emergency alarms shrieked. Lights failed. Then backup systems kicked in, bathing everything in red emergency lighting. Elder Cathara appeared beside him, moving with surprising speed for someone her age. "The structure cannot hold much longer. We must evacuate everyone now," she said urgently. Kyle checked his numbers. They still had nearly 1,000 Viridians inside the shelter, many of them trapped in sections that had been cut off by the collapse. He grabbed his radio. "All shuttles, this is Bennett. We have a critical situation. The shelter is coming down. We need every available craft on the ground now." Lieutenant Frank Dixon gathered his Marines. "We are going in after them," he announced. Jacob Hayes nodded and checked his equipment. They had rescue gear from the ships, human-designed tools meant for extracting people from collapsed buildings. Greg Morris joined them with some of the mining equipment from one of the industrial ships. If they needed to move heavy debris, mining tools were better than anything the military had. The rescue operation inside the crumbling shelter was desperate and dangerous. Dixon's team moved through corridors where the ceiling sagged and walls cracked. They found groups of Viridians trapped behind collapsed sections and used the mining equipment to cut through. Morris rigged emergency support structures using ship components, literally holding up sections of ceiling with whatever he could find while people escaped beneath them. One section had completely collapsed, burying about 50 Viridians beneath tons of rubble. Dixon looked at the pile of debris and felt his heart sink. It would take hours to clear it, and they did not have hours. Then Velkoth, the Viridian engineer, pushed forward. He placed his crystalline hands on the rubble and closed his eyes. The debris began to glow with the same blue light they had seen on the mountains. It shifted, moved, lifted slightly. Viridians can manipulate crystalline structures, Morris realized. That is how they built all this. He joined Velkoth, using human cutting tools where the Viridians' abilities worked and adding support struts where they did not. Together, human and Viridian engineers performed what looked like magic, clearing the debris in minutes instead of hours. The trapped Viridians emerged shaken but alive. Up in orbit, Paul Martinez faced his own crisis. The gravitational anomalies were getting worse as the planet destabilized. Ships were having trouble maintaining stable orbits. The civilian vessels not designed for this kind of stress were particularly vulnerable. Paul pushed the Defender's engines beyond recommended limits, using the cruiser's mass and power to create a stable gravitational reference point for the other ships. His engineering crew sent him increasingly worried reports about engine stress, but he ignored them. They would fix the engines later. Right now, people needed help. Sophie Clark aboard the Constellation watched her orbit decay despite the Defender's efforts. Her luxury liner was not built for this. The ship's systems were complaining, alarms going off across multiple decks. Some of her crew, civilian employees who signed up to work on a cruise ship, started questioning whether they should stay. Sophie called a meeting in the main ballroom, now converted into a refugee center filled with Viridian families. Look around you, she told her crew. These people have lost everything. Their world is literally falling apart beneath them. We are all they have. I know this is not what you signed up for. I know it is dangerous and scary. But we are human, and this is what humans do. We help. If anyone wants to leave, I will put them on a shuttle back to the nearest station. But I am staying, and I am seeing this through to the end. Not a single crew member took her up on the offer. A few days later, Sophie's speech would be broadcast across human space and become one of the defining moments of the rescue operation. But right then, in that moment, it was just a captain reminding her crew who they were. Back on the dying planet, Kyle made a decision he had been dreading. The shelter was minutes from complete collapse. Most of the Viridians were out, but a small group had been cut off by a new chasm that had opened in the ground. They were trapped on the far side, unable to reach the landing zone. The shuttles could not reach them where they were, and there was no time to find another route. Elder Kethara refused to leave without them. I will not abandon my people, she said firmly. Kyle looked at Lisa, then at Jacob Hayes and Frank Dixon. The three of them nodded in silent agreement. Then we go get them, Kyle said. He radioed up to Admiral Stone. We need the mining walker from the Titan's Glory, and we need Ryan Scott to wait for one more pickup, no matter what. The mining walker was a massive vehicle designed to operate on hostile worlds. It had legs instead of wheels, each one equipped with stabilizers for rough terrain. It was slow, heavily armored, and exactly what they needed. A shuttle brought it down, and Kyle, Lisa, Jacob, Dixon, and Elder Kethara climbed aboard. The controls were built for industrial work, not rescue missions, but Lisa figured them out quickly enough. The journey across the dying landscape was like traveling through the end of the world. The ground cracked and heaved beneath the walkers' feet. Lava erupted from newly formed fissures, spraying molten rock into the toxic atmosphere. Mountains crumbled in the distance, their collapse sending shockwaves across the entire region. The walkers' sensors screamed warnings that everyone inside ignored. They had a job to do. The human fleet gathered in stable space 2 days after the last shuttle lifted off from the dying planet. Admiral Victoria Stone met with Elder Kethara aboard the Resolution to go over the final numbers. Every single Viridian had been accounted for. There were injuries, both human and Viridian, but no deaths. Given the circumstances, it was almost unbelievable. Victoria found herself thinking that they had gotten incredibly lucky, but she knew it was more than luck. It was preparation, determination, and a lot of people refusing to give up. The cost was substantial. 3 shuttles had been lost during the evacuation, their hulls simply unable to withstand the repeated stress of flying through that hostile atmosphere. 2 ships had sustained damage that would require months in dry dock to repair properly. The fuel expenditure alone was staggering, enough to power a small colony for an entire year. Some politicians back on Earth were already preparing speeches about fiscal irresponsibility and reckless endangerment. But Dr. Christine Walsh had been busy during the evacuation, conducting interviews with Viridian historians and scholars. What she discovered made all the costs seem trivial. The Viridians were not just another species. They were one of the founding races of what eventually became the Galactic Assembly. Their civilization was ancient, when most current Assembly members were still living in caves. They had withdrawn from galactic society thousands of years ago, after philosophical differences with other species, seeking isolation to preserve their way of life. More importantly, they had brought their archives with them, vast databases of information spanning millennia, stored in crystalline matrices that had survived the planet's destruction. Christine spent hours poring over what the Viridians were willing to share, and what she found was astounding. Technology that humanity had not even dreamed of. Historical records of civilizations that rose and fell before the current galactic order existed. Knowledge that could advance human science by centuries. Elder Kethara requested a private meeting with Captain Kyle Bennett and Admiral Stone 3 days into the journey back to human space. They met in a conference room aboard the Resolution, just the three of them. The Elder's crystalline form seemed to glow with an inner light as she spoke. "I need to tell you something about the distress beacon we activated." It was not simply a call for rescue. Kyle and Victoria exchanged glances. Kethara continued. "When our ancestors withdrew from the galactic community, they did so because they believed the Assembly had become too cautious, too risk-averse. The ancient species had achieved stability, yes, but at the cost of their ability to act decisively when action was needed. My people foresaw a time when this caution would become a fatal weakness. So you were testing us," Victoria said quietly. Kethara's multifaceted eyes reflected the room's light in rainbow patterns. In a manner of speaking. The beacon was set to broadcast on frequencies associated with deep space exploration and emergency response. Only certain types of civilizations monitor those frequencies. Civilizations that value exploration, civilizations that respond to distress calls. We believed that whoever answered would possess qualities the galaxy desperately needs. "And we passed?" Kyle asked. Kethara's form brightened, a Viridian expression of joy. "You exceeded every expectation. Your species mobilized dozens of ships within hours. You spent resources you could barely afford. You risked lives for people you had never met. You refused to accept that some situations are too difficult or too expensive to address. In all my centuries of life across all the civilizations I have studied, I have never witnessed such a pure expression of what it means to be truly civilized." The implications of this revelation took time to sink in. The Viridians had not just been rescued. They had chosen to be found by a species they deemed worthy. It changed everything about how humanity would be perceived in the galaxy. But more immediately it meant that the Viridians came with gifts beyond just their presence. They came with knowledge, technology, and most importantly validation that humanity's instincts were right. News of the successful rescue had already spread across assembly space. Ambassador Daniel Wright found himself suddenly treated very differently by the Council. Species that had dismissed humanity as reckless newcomers were now requesting meetings. The Colorians, a proud warrior culture, sent a formal message expressing admiration for human courage under fire. The Thalas Consortium, master engineers, wanted to study how human crews had modified their ships so quickly to accommodate Viridian refugees. But not everyone was pleased. Archon Thelvas of the Sivorian Accord called another council session. The ancient species that had led the assembly for 10,000 years were worried. Daniel stood before the council again, but this time the atmosphere was different. Before they had been dismissive. Now they were wary, and Daniel was not sure which was worse. The Archon spoke carefully. "Ambassador Wright, your species has accomplished something remarkable. You have saved lives that would have been lost. You have returned the Viridians to the galactic community. These are good things. However, your methods concern us. You acted without authorization. You mobilized a fleet without proper oversight. You spent resources with no guarantee of success. What happens next time? What if your impulsiveness leads to disaster instead of triumph?" Daniel chose his words with care. "With respect, Archon, we acted because waiting would have meant watching people die. Your assessment teams were 2 weeks away. The Viridians had days. Sometimes caution is wisdom. Sometimes it is just fear dressed up in procedure. We chose to risk failure rather than guarantee tragedy through inaction. And yes, it could have gone wrong. But it did not. And now 3,000 lives continue because we were willing to try." Elder Kethara was granted speaking privileges before the council, a rare honor for any species, and unprecedented for one that had been absent from galactic affairs for millennia. She stood before the assembled representatives and delivered a speech that would be quoted for generations. "I have lived for 643 of your standard years," she began. "I have seen civilizations rise and fall. I have watched species achieve greatness and collapse into irrelevance. I have studied what makes a society truly advanced, and I have learned that age is not wisdom, and caution is not necessarily prudent," she continued, speaking with the authority of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. "The humans rescued us not because they expected reward or recognition. They came because they heard someone in distress and refused to ignore that call. In those desperate days, I watched human pilots fly missions that terrified them. I saw human engineers work past exhaustion. I witnessed human leaders make decisions that put their careers and lives at risk, all for strangers from a species they had never known existed. That is civilization in its truest form, not the civilization of ancient monuments and vast databases, but the civilization of compassion in action." The debate that followed lasted 3 full assembly days. Some species argued for restricting human expansion, fearing that their impulsive nature would destabilize the careful balance the assembly had maintained. Others argued for embracing humanity's approach, suggesting that perhaps the assembly had indeed grown too comfortable in its cautious ways. The younger species in the assembly were particularly vocal in their support. They saw in humanity a kindred spirit, a reminder that civilizations could be measured by their actions rather than just their age. The Twilight Collective, an ancient and mysterious species that rarely engaged in assembly politics, made a rare public statement through their representative speaker Velashan. The collective had existed longer than most species could comprehend, and their words carried weight. "We have watched countless civilizations develop over the eons," Velashan said in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Most follow predictable patterns. They prioritize survival, then expansion, then consolidation. Few ever truly prioritize others over themselves. Humanity has reminded the galaxy that empathy is not weakness, and action is not recklessness when driven by genuine compassion. They have our respect." Eventually, a compromise emerged. Humanity would be granted expanded assembly membership with certain privileges and responsibilities. They would become the assembly's designated rapid response force for emergency situations, particularly those involving hostile environments. In exchange, humans agreed to enhanced oversight of their more ambitious expansion projects and committed to working within assembly frameworks for non-emergency situations. It was not perfect, but it was progress. Back on Earth, the rescue operation dominated every news cycle. Footage from the operation showed human crews working desperately to save people they had never met. Children in school studied the rescue as an example of humanity at its best. Artists created works commemorating the event. Historians debated whether this would be remembered as the moment humanity truly joined the galactic community. There were critics, of course. Economist Dr. Sarah Brooks appeared on numerous broadcasts, calculating the cost of the operation and questioning its fiscal responsibility. Some politicians argued that humanity should focus on its own development rather than taking responsibility for every species in trouble. The debates grew heated, with opinion divided roughly along the lines of those who bell. 6 months after the rescue, Kyle stood in the central plaza of New Terra's newest settlement and watched Viridian children playing with human children. The integration had been surprisingly smooth. New Terra was a young colony world with environmental conditions harsh enough that most assembly species avoided it, but perfect for both humans and Viridians. The high gravity that other species found exhausting was comfortable for beings who had evolved on Deathworlds. The temperature swings that drove climate-controlled species crazy were merely weather to people who knew how to adapt. Elder Cathara joined him at the plaza's edge, her crystalline form catching the afternoon sunlight in beautiful patterns. "In all my centuries, I have never seen 2 species integrate so rapidly," she remarked. Kyle watched a human girl show a young Viridian boy how to kick a ball. The boy's 4 limbs gave him an advantage that the girl immediately tried to counter with speed. They were laughing, the universal language of children at play. "Maybe it is because both our species understand what it means to survive," Kyle suggested. "We both know what it is like to face extinction and choose to endure." The technological exchange was accelerating human development in ways nobody had anticipated. Viridian crystalline computing, which stored vast amounts of information in specially grown crystal matrices, was revolutionizing human data systems. Greg Morris and his Viridian partner Velkoth had established a joint research facility that was producing innovations faster than either species could have managed alone. Human mechanical engineering combined with Viridian energy manipulation created hybrid technologies that neither civilization had dreamed of independently. The medical advances were equally impressive. Dr. Nicole Carter and Viridian healer Shalinara had published 3 groundbreaking papers on cross-species medicine. Viridian diagnostic techniques using crystalline resonance could detect problems that human scanners missed. Human pharmaceutical knowledge helped treat conditions that Viridian medicine had struggled with for centuries. Their work was already saving lives across the assembly, and they had barely scratched the surface of what was possible. But the rescue operation had consequences that reached far beyond technology and medicine. Other species from hostile worlds began reaching out to humanity and the Viridians. These Deathworld species had always been somewhat marginalized in the assembly. Their robust physiologies and harsh homeworlds made them different from the comfortable species that dominated galactic politics. Now they saw in the human-Viridian partnership a model for cooperation that played to their strengths rather than treating their adaptations as disadvantages. Commander Paul Martinez, promoted to admiral after the rescue operation, found himself coordinating what became known as the Deathworlder Alliance. It was not a military pact or political faction. It was a mutual aid organization. Species from hostile worlds had unique capabilities for operating in dangerous environments. When the assembly faced crises in extreme conditions, the Deathworlder Alliance became the first responders. They were the ones who could survive where others could not, who could work in conditions that would kill more delicate species. The Alliance's first real test came sooner than anyone expected. A research station in orbit around a volatile star suffered catastrophic system failures. 200 scientists from various assembly species were trapped in a facility that was falling apart, exposed to radiation levels that were lethal to most forms of life. Standard rescue ships could not get close enough to help. The environment was simply too hostile, but the combined human-Viridian fleet, supported by 3 other Deathworld species, executed a flawless evacuation. They went in where others could not, endured conditions that would have killed standard rescue teams, and brought everyone out alive. The galaxy watched as these species from the harshest worlds became the Assembly's most reliable emergency services. Captain Helen Rogers, who had commanded the Endeavour during the Viridian rescue, became the Alliance's operational coordinator. Under her leadership, the Alliance established response protocols that dramatically improved the Assembly's ability to handle crisis situations. Response times that had been measured in weeks now took days. Bureaucratic procedures that had required endless committee meetings were streamlined to focus on saving lives first and filling out paperwork later for the individuals who had participated in the original rescue. Life had changed in various ways. Kyle accepted promotion to Admiral in command of humanity's Exploration Division. He led missions to the galaxy's most challenging regions, places where the combination of human adaptability and determination could make a real difference. Lisa Vaughn became captain of a new ship, the Viridian Hope, a joint human-Viridian vessel that symbolized the partnership between the 2 species. She flew missions that required both human tactical thinking and Viridian technical expertise. Lieutenant Frank Dixon found his calling as an instructor. He established the first joint human-Viridian military academy, training the next generation in what he called practical heroism. It was not about glory or medals. It was about having the skills and mindset needed to save lives in impossible circumstances. His students, both human and Viridian, learned that true strength came from knowing when to act decisively and when to work as a team. They learned that being tough enough to survive a death world meant you had a responsibility to help those who were not as fortunate. Ryan Scott, the pilot who had flown the final rescue mission under conditions that should have been impossible, became a legend among pilots across human space. He trained the next generation, emphasizing that fancy maneuvers and speed records mattered less than getting people home safely. His students learned to fly like Ryan, with skill and courage, but also with the understanding that every passenger was someone's family, someone's friend, someone worth bringing home alive. 3 years after the rescue, Ambassador Daniel Wright delivered a speech at the Assembly Hall on the anniversary of first contact with the Viridians. The galaxy had changed significantly in that time. The assembly, which had once moved at the pace of glaciers, had learned to act more decisively when situations demanded it. Response times for emergencies had improved. Bureaucracy had been streamlined. The ancient species had remembered that wisdom sometimes meant acting swiftly rather than debating endlessly. But Daniel also cautioned against complacency in his speech. Humanity's strength, he reminded the assembly, did not come from any inherent superiority. It came from their fundamental conviction that every life had value worth protecting. That conviction had to be preserved as humans grew and integrated further into galactic society. They must never become so comfortable that they stopped hearing the desperate calls across the stars. They must never let procedure and protocol become more important than the lives those procedures were meant to protect. Elder Cathara, now serving as the Viridian ambassador to the assembly, added her perspective to the anniversary celebration. She spoke of how humanity had reminded the galaxy what it meant to be truly civilized. Civilization, she explained, was not about how long you had existed or how much territory you controlled. It was not about the size of your databases or the age of your monuments. True civilization was measured by what you were willing to sacrifice for strangers, by how you responded when others needed help, by whether you ran toward danger or away from it when lives were at stake. The speech was broadcast across assembly space and became one of the most quoted pieces of galactic philosophy in recent memory. Younger species took it as validation of their own values. Older species found themselves reevaluating beliefs they had held for millennia. The Twilight Collective, those ancient mysterious beings, sent a rare message to the assembly hall. In humanity and their partners, they had written, "We see the future of this galaxy." Not because they are perfect, but because they remember that compassion is strength, not weakness. Kyle found himself back aboard the Horizon Seeker for the anniversary, the ship that had started everything by detecting that desperate signal. The vessel had been refitted and upgraded. Half his crew now included officers from other species, particularly Viridians. His science team combined human curiosity with Viridian knowledge. His engineering section used hybrid technology that neither species could have developed alone. The ship was better than it had been before, stronger through cooperation. As the Horizon Seeker prepared to depart for a new deep space exploration mission, Kyle stood on the bridge and looked at his crew. They were preparing to venture into regions of space that few had explored, looking for new worlds, new civilizations, new knowledge. But Kyle knew that if they encountered anyone in trouble, if they detected another distress signal calling across the void, they would respond. They would drop everything and go help. Because that was what the Deathworlder Alliance did. That was what humans did. Peter Grant, still serving as communications officer after all these years, reported all frequencies clear. No distress signals detected in their planned route. But Kyle knew that somewhere in the vast galaxy, someone was probably in trouble. Someone was broadcasting a desperate call for help into the darkness, hoping against hope that someone would hear and care enough to respond. And if that call reached human space, if it reached any member of